Church, we are in a maybe never-ending series on the Gospel of John. It just keeps expanding. I don't know how to cut it off. Blame Chris. He's really done a significant number of the work of making me stretch it. But I'm really excited because, as we've said all week, the Gospel of John is a book deep enough for elephants to swim but shallow enough for children to wade. It is a book that you can come to at any point in your life or your faith and get something out of it, whether you've read it a bajillion times or it's your very first time reading it, whether you have been doing this Christian thing for decades or if this is your first book of the Bible you've ever opened. It's a book that just meets you with that. And I hope we've kind of pulled back the curtain on it. We named that John tells us why John wrote this book in John 20, but these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing you will have life in his name. The purpose of this book is to lead us to a place of understanding who God is, and more importantly, I would argue with what John is doing, to produce life worth living, that abundant life that we get invited into. And so I want to sit in the depth of it. We've, to that end, really started to pull John apart through the themes that it carries through. So at the very beginning, we are given this poem about light and the darkness cannot overcome it. Then we move into 7 titles given to Jesus in the first chapter to tell us who John thinks this guy is, and then invites us to come and see, come and see, come and see. Then we dig into the 7 signs that Jesus has worked throughout the gospel. Signs is what John calls miracles because they are not about the thing that happens. They are pointing to a more significant thing, and that is who Jesus is. Then we move into the 7, what else did we do? 7 signs, 7 titles, 7 I am statements. Thanks, Marnie. And the 7 I am statements of Jesus telling us who he is. See, we need a church that pays attention because I can't remember week to week. That tells us where Jesus thinks he is and not just who John thinks he is. And then we started into the 4s because John loves patterns, apparently. And we talked about the 4 institutions that Jesus subverts. We talked about last week. I missed it because of stomach flu, so forgive me. But John Marshall did a phenomenal job naming the first 2 institutions that Jesus subverts as ritual washing and the priesthood. Those are, I would categorize as the ways we get to God. So instead of needing to be clean and pure, instead of needing a priest to go as your intercessor, Jesus comes and says, I'm here to do that work for you. So just come straight to me. But this week I want to talk about the wheres we get to God. And mercifully, if you've been tired of the massive walls of text we've been reading, John does both of these institutions in one chapter. So we're going to dive right in to John 4. It's still 26 verses, but could have been worse. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples than John, although it was not Jesus himself but his disciples who baptized, he left Judea and started back to Galilee. But he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." And the woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with the sons in his flock who drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one who is now you are with now is not your husband. What you have said is true." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me. The hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know, and we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming. He's got to get the little jab in, right? Jesus is a good Jew. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such things as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And the woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. And Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Now, we've preached on this passage a bunch of different times for a bunch of different reasons. A few months ago, we talked about the fact that often we say this woman is ostracized because she's had a lot of people that she's not married to and she's sleeping around. And we named that there's just no biblical framework for that possibly being true. This is a woman who has been widowed many times and is now living with someone in the family to protect her because Samaritans were equally as religious as Jews around marriage and infidelity and other things. And you don't get married 4 times if you keep cheating on your husbands. That doesn't happen. So this is a good woman who has done her best to follow God and has been given so many short crayons that she is almost certainly seen as cursed. Feel free to go listen to that message. So I don't want to wrestle with who she is or what is going on here or why Jesus had to go to Samaria when it's not on the way to where he was actually going or what is going on here. I want to instead actually give credence and honest engagement with the theological debate she gives, because this is a real serious debate. This is a real central framework for what it means to be a Samaritan. Do you worship God on Mount Gerizim? Is that where the holiest place on humanity is? Or is Yahweh found in Jerusalem? Samaritans were a shoot off of Judaism from the 11th century BCE during one of the big Jewish diaspora moments where they are spread out. The Samaritans decide we don't need any of the books other than the books of Moses. We have the Torah, and that is all we need. There have been no prophets other than Moses. And so here is who we are. And Moses and where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Gerizim, so that is where we will set up our altar. And the Jews later in centuries said, no. Moses was going to sacrifice Isaac on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that is the holiest site. And so the Jews built a temple, and the Samaritans built a temple, and they had competing temples, even though they both claimed Abraham as their father. And then when the Jewish temple was sacked during Roman conquest, so too was the Samaritan temple. They've had parallel stories for millennia, for hundreds and hundreds of years at this point. And they really, really care, because if Yahweh is somewhere on earth, it's probably important to know where that is. And if Yahweh is somewhere where people can go into Yahweh's presence, you want to go to the right place. Because if I tell you it's the broom closet and you get in there and Yahweh is not there, why are you standing in a broom closet, right? And so there's something that we are being invited to in this debate. Dear Jewish man, where is this God we're supposed to worship? Because I think there's some impliedness of, I think you're wrong because you're Jewish, but also nothing is working out well for me. So if you have a better answer, I'm interested in it. And Jesus' response is that you do not need to look to Jerusalem. You do not need to look to Mount Gerizim. God is everywhere in spirit and in truth. That you can meet God where you are. You do not have to travel. There are not rules to get it. That means there are not people that keep the unworthy out. That means there are not people that get to tell you how you are allowed to move towards God. That means there are not systems and powers to profit off what you want to do. In fact, you can go anywhere with no money at all and come into the presence of the God of the universe. And this woman is compelled by that. Tell me more about this. There is an invitation to us when we look at what it means to subvert the temple, to subvert holy places. Jacob's well is there, right? There is a long-standing tradition that God is certain places and God is not other places. Now, we're all 21st century smart theological people, so we would never think God could only be found in the temple in Jerusalem. But we might think that God is most clear at church. And so when I come to church, I need to be on my best behavior and I need to put on my good clothes. And that's where I'm going to meet God for the week. And that's where I expect God to give me a message. And that's where I know that if I do that, I'll be in my faith because everything is good if I'm in church. And then some of us are even more advanced than that. We recognize that the church could not hold God. And so we go on hikes, and that's where we meet God. We show up at a fishing camp, and that's where we meet God. We protest outside the Capitol, and that's where we meet God. But if we're honest, we're all still doing the same thing. God is that place, whether it's a church that I've chosen to attend or a church that I've chosen to baptize as a church. The hike that I go on, that's where God is. So God could not be anywhere else. The reality is, I have had so many people say, I don't go to church. God is not there. I go on a hike. And I have had many people say, I can't imagine calling yourself a Christian and not showing up at church because that is where God is. And I have watched people change personalities as they walk through the door of this building or other churches I've been at because now they're in the presence of God and so they better behave. But the message of John 4 is that you're all wrong. We're all wrong. Yes. Can you meet God on a hike? Of course you can meet God on a hike. You can meet God in spirit and truth anywhere. Can you meet God in a church? Of course you can meet God in a church. Look how pretty that Jesus icon is. Of course God is here. Can you meet God at a protest? Of course, because God's heart breaks for the oppressed and God has heard their cries and come down to do something about it. So we meet God in those protests. Of course God is there. But for those of us that meet God in protest, are we ready to meet God in church? For those of us that meet God on a hike, are we ready to meet God reading our Bibles? That one's probably harder for some of us. For those of us that know that God is in church, are we looking for him in our conversation with the checker at the counter at Safeway or Fred Meyer or Trader Joe's? We know God is at Trader Joe's. That's if you assume God is only at Trader Joe's, it's kind of a cult there. Could you imagine that you might meet God at the AM PM, at 10 p.m.? The promise of John is that there are not places where God is not. Because God is not like accessed through geography. God is accessed through attentiveness. And so the invitation to us is to turn on our antenna and to turn up its sensitivity and meet God where we are, and go other places where we will also meet God. In that conversation with our kids, in that fight with that teacher, in that moment in traffic, in that place in the woods, in whatever other thing it might be, we can go in spirit and truth and meet the God of the universe where we are. Which means you don't need me. I hope that I help in this journey towards God, but I am not a gatekeeper of it. You don't need a church building. We meet in an old video game store. And, there's prettier spaces out there. And yet, God can be here. The promise of John is that you do not have to go somewhere to end up in the presence of the God of the universe. The invitation of John is to figure out how to worship in spirit and in truth. And I do have suggestions. There are age-old, tried-and-true principles of how we tune into the God of the universe. One of them is surrounding yourself with other people who are trying to tune into the God of the universe. I think going to church is a great place for that. Ideally, our churches are diverse enough that we have an expansive framework of how to tune into God together that we cannot have in our own little bubbles. To spend time in the Bible. I know so many of us gave up our Bibles years ago, and some of us read them every single morning. But the invitation for all of us is to trust whether you've read this, whether you're excited to read it, whether you're doing it because you want to or because you have to, that God may show up in that text. My professor in seminary used to say, they're called spiritual disciplines because it takes discipline to do them. They're not called spiritual funsies. If they were spiritual funsies, it would be like, eat sugar and God will show up. But that is not how it works. I wish. Can God show up in sugar? Yeah. Tune your attention, right? Turn on your radar. But the bigger thing is, do the work to be made into the image of Christ in you. That does mean showing up. That does mean reading things. That does mean loving the poor. That does mean being out in creation and giving attention to God. That does mean prayer. That does mean listening. That means reflection. That means all of the things that we could be tempted to say, that is a dead vessel that doesn't get me there. We don't get to decide where God's Spirit can be, and God's Spirit can apparently breathe life into dead bones. So I don't think we have to say that that ritual is dead to us. What we get to say is that ritual is not the means with which I get to God. That is the place where God meets me, just like everything else. The beauty. Can you imagine being this woman who is alone, who is probably not all that welcome at the temple in Mount Gerizim because she's had a lot of curses going on in her life, doesn't have a lot of community, doesn't have access to God. And Jesus tells her, all you need is to tune into God's Spirit, and you will have enough forever in everything, always. Can you imagine the ability to celebrate that would be bubbling up in her? For any of us that have been told, you go to that church, well, God's not in that one. You vote for that candidate, well, God wouldn't care about. Whatever thing it might be, Jesus says, don't limit God's Spirit. This is the Spirit that hovered over the waters before everything. This is the Spirit that spoke and existence came into being. This is the Spirit that spoke and a storm is calmed. This is a God that can meet you wherever you are. Rest in it. Celebrate in it. There's a beauty to that. So for those of you that think you can only meet God on a hike, only because you're turning off your antenna other places. For those of you that think you should only be a certain way in church because that's where God is, let's work on decompartmentalizing our lives. Let's aim for congruence, because once we can be honestly and authentically ourselves everywhere, then God works with us. As a youth pastor and a young life leader, I used to always tell my kids, if you swear at home or with your friends, you can swear with me. Not actually because I just want you to be like swearing left and right, but I don't want you to pretend you're a different person with me than you are with everyone else. Let's aim for congruence here. For any of us in this church that feel like we have to put on our church outfit to walk in these doors, be congruent. We were up last night with Noah being sick, and I'm pretty tired. It would be incongruent to pretend I was bursting with energy. And yet, God meets us in our congruence. God meets us where we are. God meets us in our spirit, regardless of how close or far away we are from the places we have learned how to follow God up until now. Because we worship God in spirit and in truth. And we tune our antennas in churches and holy sites, on hikes and at protests and wherever else it might be. So tune your antennas. But once they're tuned, open your eyes to God everywhere. God with us. Remember we talked about with the Lord's Prayer, our Father, the one in the heavens that start with the air touching our faces. If our Father is in the heavens starting here, then you certainly don't have to go to a temple. And God can certainly meet you in a temple. You can look at a prayer station or a beautiful piece of art or an incredible image and see God. But you can also sit in a beige room on an uncomfortable metal folding chair and see God. Let's be a people that see God. Let's pray. God, give us the eyes to see you. Jesus, thank you for meeting this woman in her loneliness and democratizing her access to you. May we be a people who run out into the world looking to discover you wherever you are. And may we also be a people that never in a million years try to stand between someone else and you. May you give us the creativity to imagine meeting you in the places that have run dry for us in the past. And may you give us courage to try new places that we didn't really imagine you could be up until now. In your holy and mighty name, amen.